Hello, good day. Welcome to the part two of the behavior of the interest rate lecture here. In this particular lecture, we are going to look at the derivation of the bond demand curve. And from this derivation, basically, we are going to determine the relationship between the price and quantity demand of bonds. And once we are aware of the behavior between or the relationship between the quantity demand and the price of the bond, we should be determining the relationship between the price and the quantity supply. And once you know the demand and supply curves, and somehow if you know that how do they interact with each other and where they actually reach to the equilibrium, from that equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity, we can find out the interest rate. Like say, for example, the equilibrium price given the interest rates, the equilibrium interest rate. Like say, for example, here, this particular formula, say, for example, if you look at on the screen, this particular formula is an yield to maturity for the discount bonds. This yield to maturity depends on two factors, like the face value of the bond. Say, for example, what is written on the bond, what price is written on the, what value is written on the face of the bond, and similarly at what price this is being traded. If you look at this formula, this is basically just give rise to the interest rate. Say, for example, if the price goes up, what should happen with the interest rate? It should go down basically because if it goes up, the difference between the face value and the price value goes down. And if this goes down, and this basically also the denominator goes up, the interest rate goes down. And similarly, if the price of the bond basically goes down, the interest rate on them actually increases because whenever this price falls, the difference between the face value and the price actually falls, actually increases, I'm sorry. So when this increases, and this basically also the fall in the price actually increases the fraction. So the overall interest rate increases. So in that way, what we can do is we can basically establish the relationship between the price and the interest rate. Like say, for example, if the price goes up, the interest rate on the bond goes down. And similarly, if the price goes down, the interest rate on the bond goes up. So this particular kind of a relationship can be used to find out the interest rates. And if the price varies because of the variations in the demand and supply, or the changes or the shifting of the demand and supply, of course, the interest rate changes. So in that way, we can basically determine that what exactly will be the interest rate in the economy and how this interest rate is going to fluctuate. And actually, the fluctuations in the interest rates happen because of the changes in the value or the price of the underlying asset, which is actually the bond in this particular case. Now, if we look at the derivation of the demand curve, like say, for example, here, if you look at the derivation of demand curve, this derivation of the demand curve actually is determined through this particular uh, kind of behavior. So look at this diagram. In this diagram, you are actually looking how you are having two kinds of curves. One is this downward sloping demand curve, and the other one is the upward sloping supply curve. So what do you see here? Say for example, if you look at here, what are we doing basically? We are measuring the price of a bond on the y-axis, and we are measuring the quantity of the bond on x-axis. Okay, so this particular kind of a this relationship is basically telling us, like say for example, this quantity here and the price there. So we are basically trying to create a link, and say for example, for every price there is a corresponding interest rate. Like say for example, you remember that the interest rate is basically is a fraction or is a ratio between the difference between the face value and the price and divide by the price. Say for example, if the bond basically has got the face value which is equal to $100,000, say for example $1,000, and if the price of that bond is also $1,000, you may imagine and you can see that what will happen with the interest rate. Like say for example, if this is $1,000 and this is also $1,000, $1,000 minus $1,000 will be equal to zero. So the corresponding value of the interest rate with 1,000 rupees or the $1,000 is basically the interest rate which is equal to zero. Now, what happens if the price of the bond falls? Like say for example, if the price of the bond actually goes to 950. Now, if the face value is 1,000, like say for example, if you just subtract 950 from it and you just divide that again with the 950, the answer that you get is 0.053, which is actually the 5.3%. So which is actually the corresponding here. So it means that if you look at this demand curve of the bond, like say for example, these 2 points, basically the point A, point B, point C, point D, and point E, they are showing the different prices at which different quantities are demanded. And for that price, you can actually find out the corresponding interest rate. So, say, for example, any of the price can be plugged in into this formula, and you can find out the corresponding interest rate. Like, say, for example, the corresponding interest rates with the value of the 950 actually of the dollars bond basically is 5.3%. And if the price of the bond further falls, like say, for example, to the $900, the value of that particular interest rate will go up, and this will actually become 11.1%. And similarly, if that further goes down to 850, the interest rate will goes up to the 17.6%. Similarly, the 800 give rise to 25% interest rate. So what you can see here, that the price, if the price is increasing, like, that is leading to a decrease in the interest rates. So somehow, like, any point on this particular demand curve, which is A, B, C, D, or any point E, like, they all basically are not only showing the relationship between the price and quantity demand, but every corresponding price basically has got a corresponding interest rate. Okay. So similarly, if you look at the behavior of the supply of bonds, you being a holder of a bond, supplies the bond when you actually get better price in the market. That's what basically is a very simple rule of this quantity supplied. And there is a simple rule basically that how the people basically increase or sell their bonds when the price goes up. Because when the price of the bond goes up, like say, for example, if you have bought a bond for $850, and if the price of that bond becomes $900 in the market, obviously that will actually get you $50 return on that particular investment. And that return can actually entice you or attract you to sell the products, which is bond here. So it means that the price of the bond and the interest rate on the bond basically have got a positive relationship. Now you can also actually see, like, that every corresponding price of the bond that actually is lying on the supply curve or the demand curve has got the corresponding interest rates. Like say, for example, 800 has got the corresponding interest rates of 25%. 850 has got the corresponding interest rates of 17.6%. Similarly, 900 with 11.1%, and 950 with actually, with the 5.3%. And similarly, the $1,000 price and the $1,000 face value gets you, like, say, for example, the 0% interest rates. So in that way, we can see, like, that the demand curve is downward sloping because people actually demand more bond when the price is low, because when the price is low, the return is high. And similarly, when the price is high, the return is low, people buy it and demand less bonds. The opposite happens for the supply of bonds. Like say, for example, when the price of a bond increases, you actually get capital gains. And that capital gains attract you to sell your bonds if you actually want to sell them in the market and you don't want to hold them for the period of maturity. So this particular kind of a relationship between the supply of the bond and the demand for the bond, if you just somehow interact them together, you generally find out a point that actually coincides on the both demand and supply curve. Like say, for example, here, you may see that this point C is basically lying on the both demand as well as the supply curve. So this particular point C is basically showing that this is the quantity of $300 billion, which actually consumers are willing to demand at $850. And similarly, this is what actually also the price, $850, at which the suppliers are willing to supply $300 billion worth of the bonds. So here, basically, if you look at, and if you somehow are able to determine the equilibrium interest rates, that equilibrium interest rates give rise to the equilibrium, that equilibrium price basically actually gives rise to the equilibrium interest rates. So what we have learned in this lecture, we have learned that how the demand and interaction between the demand and supply of the bonds determine the equilibrium price, and how this equilibrium price can be used to determine the interest rates. So somehow, if in this particular market, if you know that what are the factors which actually changes the demand curve of the bond, and what are the factors that changes the demand supply curve of the bonds, you can also understand that what kind of change will bring what kind of change in the price and the quantity in the overall market. And this corresponding price will actually help you determine the corresponding interest rates. So it means that this theory can be very easily used to understand that how the interest rates are determined and why the interest rate fluctuates. Generally, this fluctuations of the interest rate lies under the in the variations of the bonds, basically the demand for the bond and the supply for the bond. In the next chapter, we shall be looking at the loanable fund theory, and then we shall be trying to determine that how the interest rate can be determined through another theory, which is called the loanable fund theory. In this particular lecture, we have used the demand and supply of the bond. Now, basically, we are going to look at what actually happens in the loanable fund market, where the loanable fund is being demanded and supplied. Thank you for joining us, and keep watching us for the part number 3 for this continuing lecture. Thank you very much.